Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. In this episode, a conversation about covering local news. I don't think it matters where you live. News about your local communities isn't always readily available. There are those in the business swimming against the tide, offering readers and listeners an alternative. This podcast profiles one such individual. Jan Murphy has a passion for writing. He's been doing it professionally for over 25 years as a reporter and features writer for the local paper. Jan firmly believes in the importance of focusing on local stories that resonate with the community, stories told with honesty and emotion. When not crafting those local narratives, you can find him enjoying his other passion, wrestling. He is one of a very few, if not the only journalist in the country focused on the sport. Jan has also taken it a step further with his ownership stake in Chinlock Wrestling, a business promoting these popular entertainment events. This conversation was recorded in mid-June of 2024. Jan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's a tremendous honor. I had a chance to listen to your podcasts, and I enjoy them greatly.
I've noticed that you spend a fair amount of time on social media in various capacities, but I do notice that you are taking guitar lessons.
I am. I have always loved music, always, but since we came out of COVID, I've fallen more in love with music, live music. I've gone to a lot of concerts and never learned how to play an instrument. When I was in public school, I played the drums a little bit in the forced music class that they make you take it when you're, 8, 9, 10 years old. But by the time I got to high school, I didn't have an interest in playing an instrument. I played a lot of sports, and I've always loved guitar players. Angus Young is my personal hero, and my kids were taking some lessons, singing lessons and piano lessons at Long and McQuaid in Kingston, and I ran into a guy I went to high school with, Dave LaValle, who is an amazing guitar player and a music teacher, and we had the quick conversation, and he said he'd love to teach me. So when I turned 47, I guess it was just before I turned 47, I got a guitar for Christmas, and like a kid again, my mom got me a guitar, and started taking lessons. I guess it would have been a year ago in February, and still going.
Well, next time you see Dave, say hi for me. I did take some lessons from him, but he had a student who wouldn't practice the instrument, so we didn't get very far.
That is the hardest part of it all, but I will see him tonight. I have a lesson tonight.
Excellent. What's your favorite song to play at this point?
The one that I've been able to play the best and from start to finish is Chris Stapleton's Tennessee Whiskey. I don't love country, but it just so happened that that was a song that Dave sort of pointed out that might be an easy one for me to learn, to be able to play from start to finish. But anything AC/DC. I mean, we fiddle with AC/DC every week. Very, very, I know it's very simple, 3 chords, but it's played very, very fast, and it's not as easy as everybody makes it sound like it is at 3 chords.
And I did get the opportunity to see AC/DC in concert in Ottawa a few years ago, and
I was there too.
They put on a great show.
2016, right?
It may have been, yeah.
Yeah.
I lost track of time. Anyway, you have been writing for the Kingston Week Standard for a number of years, and I wanted to talk about writing, but I wanted to talk about the paper a little bit for those people who are not aware of Kingston or not aware of the newspaper that's here. It's been around almost 200 years. A little bit of background on the paper, if you can.
Yeah, it's the still the oldest continuously published daily newspaper. Now, the language means something because I believe there is a paper that's older, but did not publish consecutively. The Whig has published consecutively now for since 1834. I was going to say the early 1800s. A couple of name changes along the way, but was privately owned until 1990, I believe, is when they sold it to Southam, and Southam ran it for a number of years after the Davies family had it. And the Davies family are still in Kingston. Those who remain still, I believe, still even a little with some hands in the publishing industry. Still, I could be wrong on that, but I do believe I've heard that they still, have a little bit to do with publishing in the industry a little bit. And when they sold it, it has changed hands. I came along in 1998 when Southam still had it, and then it has changed hands 3 or 4 other times since the late 90s, and now is one of Postmedia's newspapers. So it's kind of the second biggest media company in Canada, I think, behind Torstar. In terms of readership, I'm not sure who has more, but there are basically 2 companies now that look after all the newspapers in Canada. Right. But yeah, I mean, when I came along in the 90s, it was still a very, very strong community. The voice of Kingston, was the number one news source, and I think we still are. It's just harder to track now. We don't do reader surveys, and you can't base your reach on subscriptions anymore like you once could, right? Because subscriptions have died off as the internet came along and apps and people reading everything online. But when I started there in the 90s, it would have been 50 or more people in the newsroom. I think we're 7 now.
I've had this discussion with a few people in different kinds of media, and the story is almost the same. A lot of consolidation, a lot of downsizing of the people who worked there. You started working with the paper long before 1998, as I recall reading somewhere where you actually delivered the newspaper when you were a kid.
I did.
Like a lot of other people.
Yeah, I grew up on a street in Strathcona where I started delivering the newspapers, just up one street on my bike, and then we moved over to Camden East. The route there was much, much bigger, so it involved a lot more of a commitment. But yeah, I delivered the paper for a number of years because I started when we were in Strathcona, and I was still doing it in Camden East, and I think we moved to Camden East when I was 12. And I probably did that until I was about 15 or 16, and then by the time I was 21, I was working at the Whig. I'm hometown paper, dream come true, right?
Where did the bug for writing come from?
Creative writing class in... there's two reasons, I say. When I was a kid, as a pro wrestling fan, I loved following WWF then, now WWE, and I loved the magazine. It was colorful, and it always had, tons of pictures and good stories on wrestlers, and I was fascinated with those. And then when I got to high school, I was in a class called a creative writing class. I don't even know if they still offer it. And the teacher was Dave Hagedorn, and for some reason, sitting down and just pouring your guts out onto a screen or onto a paper was really interesting to me, and I kind of enjoyed it. And then I guess I lucked out by getting to go work at the Beaver in Napanee, and that's kind of where things really took off for me, because I went there as a co-op student, and then I was able to stay on. I mean, they didn't pay me, but I did it because I wanted the experience. I stayed on and did some movie reviews for them and covered some sports, and went to college for photojournalism and worked on the production side of the paper at the Pioneer at the college, which I think now is going into its final year. And then I ended up in Montreal on an internship at Harrow-Smith Equinox magazine, which used to be published in Camden East. And from there, I ended up on a summer internship at the Whig, and they hired me on full-time. That was in 1998, 99.
Now, for people who may not be aware, Napanee is a community that's about a half an hour west of Kingston. It's a smaller community. I just was looking through some of the material that I found written about you, or that you had written yourself, and I may be simplifying things, but in my mind there are a couple of different approaches to what reporters do at a paper. One is stories that they are given to cover, and the other is writing feature articles, which to me is something completely different. Am I simplifying it too much, or is that basically it?
That is basically it. Okay. You can be a beat reporter where you cover a specific beat. I mean, there's less of that now, but for many years, Sue Yanagisawa was the court reporter, and Paul Schlesman was City Hall, and Rob Tripp was police, and everybody had a beat in sports. And now that we become more of a hybrid journalists, multimedia journalists, as they call us, because we take photos, shoot videos, write, do it all. Yeah, there's reporting and there's feature writing at this point. So you could simplify it to that for sure.
When you're covering stories that you've been assigned to cover, did you have a particular genre of stories that you enjoyed covering?
So my first 21 years of my career were spent on the news desk. So I started as a copy editor. So we edited copy and designed the pages, wrote all the headlines, basically built the paper as well as edited it and wrote headlines and sent it to bed, as they say, because it used to be printed in Kingston initially. We had a big plant in Kingston. And then I became the news and features editor. So I was sort of responsible for the copy desk as well as some of the features writers, entertainment, food, travel, things like that. And then it was more just toward news editor for the last 10 years before I left in 2019. During that time, however, I was writing columns. I did a lot of column writing. I wrote about becoming a dad, my challenges with weight loss. Pro wrestling I became the first. I think I'm the only remaining full-time wrestling journalist in the country. So I left, and when I came back in 2022, I became a reporter this time for the first time, like a full-time reporter. So, they like me to cover sports because I was replacing someone who had some sports assignments. But my strength is feature writing, so I don't generally get assigned those. Those come to me through my connections and social media, as you noted, just having been around and been visible for so long. And then I also cover weekends, but I'm pretty good at figuring out what's happening and, making sure I cover the important things. We can't get to everything now with so few of us. And then the odd assignment will come along for sure.
When you were covering stories, any particular stories stand out that you thought had an impact on you when you were covering those or reporting on those?
I've written over time that I lost my brother in a car accident in 2006, and I remember being at his funeral, and the editor and all the reporters, everybody that worked at the paper was at the funeral, but the editor came up to me and said, "Hey, would you be okay if we did an obituary on your brother?" And I said, "I don't want you to do that." I said, "I want to do it when I come back myself." So, his death unlocked something. I've said this many times to people privately or, people close to me. His death unlocked something within me because it changed who I was as a human being. And, having to grieve and mourn and come to grips with losing your only brother, or in my parents' case, one of their two sons, has a way of humbling you and maybe making you look at things a little bit differently. So I have been able to translate that into my writing. It's kind of like, I joke that it's my superpower, but it is. Like, I don't know how to explain it other than that's who I became, and I became this compassionate person who likes to put emotion in stories and help people understand. So since I've been back and full-time reporting, I did an interview with the gentleman, I think his name was Don Brinklow, in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory a couple of years ago, and he went into cardiac arrest while playing recreational hockey and was clinically dead for, I think it was 13 minutes. I could be off. It could be 14, 15. It was over 10 minutes. And they said because they had stripped him down and laid him on the ice to perform CPR on him, for whatever reason, that prevented brain damage, and he made a full recovery.
Extended that window, yeah.
Hearing that story, you can't help but, be moved by that. That one stands out. I just last week went down to Napanee and spent an hour speaking with Buzz Collins about his son Garrett. The Garrett's Legacy Act was just finally passed. Garrett was a young 15-year-old boy who was hanging out at the park after school in 2017 with his girlfriend and his best friend, and they were hanging out around the soccer pitch, and he jumped up to do a chin up on the soccer net that was there, and it tipped over on him and it crushed his head, and he died on the spot. And it has taken almost 8 years to get this act through because Parliament was pro-rogue. There was an election and pushing these types of things. So I mean, listening to a dad talk about his son and losing his son and all the things they've had to go through in the battles to get that into law. Another one. Last week I interviewed a gentleman whose mom was murdered in Napanee. Again, there seems to be a Napanee theme here. I'm from Napanee, so that's part of why I find myself in Napanee. But yeah, his mother was murdered 30 years ago when he was still a teenager, and he had never talked about it. And he reached out to me and said on the 30th anniversary of her murder, he wanted to talk about it. So it was a very, very emotional thing. And I guess the last one that I would say really hit me was the losing the Napanee Arena to fire. I did a series of interviews with people who had, legacies attached to that arena, and it was fantastic series to write because I got to relive my childhood and, so many great memories at that arena growing up, and at the same time kind of gave me some closure with losing that arena. So those are the kind of ones that come right to mind, but I like to treat all my stories like my children.
You mentioned before that when you wrote the story about your brother passing and that it unlocked something in you that enabled you to be a better writer. And I sort of compare that to some of the conversations I've had with musicians, with painters, that there's something in their head that they have to get out, whether it be a song that they've written or a painting that something that is flowing through them. And for those of us who don't have that privilege of having that particular superpower, I know it's difficult to explain, but I find that whole thing very interesting that, that whether it means something to somebody else, it's something that you have to get out to satisfy your particular situation, regardless of what you do with it.
I've thought that many times. Am I trying to make other people feel better to make myself feel better? I do know that I feel after I've written a piece like I want it to mean something to them. Like if I'm not saying I crave it, but I hope that, what I'm able to do with my words and having learned how to write, because it's not just putting a whole bunch of emotion into written words onto a piece of paper or onto a laptop as it is now. It's about being present. And I say this all the time. The greatest interviewer alive on earth today is Howard Stern. I know he's had this terrible past where, he was a chauvinist and a sexist and he wasn't well liked, but he has said many times he went to therapy for years to become a better human. And when he became a better human, he moved over to SiriusXM. He started getting better interviews with better guests. And now everyone who is anyone goes and does these long-form interviews with him. And I have heard thousands of his interviews, and they are so good. He has an ability to bring people, make them feel relaxed and at ease, and he earns their trust, and he gets them to tell things that they've never told. I don't go to an interview with the notes ever. I quit that about probably 5 years ago. Occasionally I'll make a couple of notes if I'm going to interview a wrestler on a phone, while I'm on the road, so I don't forget something. But when I go to do interviews like with Buzz and with other people, I don't take notes. I go and we have a conversation, and that's what comes out of it. I know that's kind of a long answer, but yeah, I mean, I certainly hope through my writing that, I guess it does make me feel better too, knowing that I've been able to tell somebody else's story the way they want it told. Mm-hmm. And and that applies to the harder subjects too, because sometimes a few months ago or a couple of months ago, I was asked by a woman living next to the integrated care hub in Kingston to come and hear her reality. And her reality was awful. It was an awful situation for her. She's living where there are people defecating on her doorstep and peering in her windows and having fires in her backyard. And I still have to be able to let her tell her story, regardless of whether people think that's fair or not. Yeah. It's still her story. It's her truth. And I think we need to, in journalism now, especially because we're in a very tough to stay in existence world right now, I think telling people's stories, community stories, are where it is and the only way to survive. Because we can get national news anywhere, right?
Yeah, exactly. We are recording this particular conversation in the summer of 2024, in the event that someone is listening in a different time. You have just started a new series where you are basically profiling people and talking about their specific passions. This is something that you came up with, or someone suggested it to you, or?
I came up with it. So I finished covering the Frontenac's. That was my first year of covering the Kingston Frontenac's beat, which is, for people may not know, local hockey team. When that finished up, it kind of freed up, some time, because through the week I'll do a feature on a player, and then I'll have 3 or 4 games throughout the week, and then news and things like that. So when the season ended, my boss had said, hey, if you want, if there's another series you've got in your mind or some things you've got in your mind, we've got some extra time now, maybe you could do that for the summer. And it just so happened that I had been to a lot of events. I try to cover as many events as I can, even if it's in a small way, because I think as the newspaper, or as a representative of the newspaper, being seen at as many events as you can, even if you can only give it a photo or a few paragraphs, is really important. So when I came back and started working weekends, I started covering as many events as I can. And I would continually run into a woman by the name of Jackie Collier. And I would see her at all these events, and she just exuded positivity and kindness, and everyone always had something so nice to say about her. So after about 8 or 9 of these encounters, I said to her, I'd like to do a feature on you. I think you're fascinating. I think, you seem to be so embedded in the community. So a few weeks went by, and I reached out to her, and we met for coffee, and we did an interview, and I actually had my little youngest daughter with me. And we talked for an hour, and I learned so much about Jackie and about, her amazing accomplishments and all the things that she does within the community, all the nonprofits that she supports, all the boards she sits on. So when I sat down to write it, I was transcribing it, and it just hit me. I went, holy, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to track down more people like Jackie, and do features on people who are basically kind. I think we're calling it kindness, or it has, I forget what the label, they changed it on me. It changed names a couple of times, but so the next one was Joanne Langlois, and I've talked to Abba Mortley. That'll be the next one coming out, and I'm going to talk to John Price and Jimmy Hassan, and I'm taking suggestions. I've got some other suggestions that have come in through email. So that's what I'm going to do now for the summer, is work on these long features on people who are, making a difference in our community. So yeah, it was spawned from that first interview.
And that's what we need to do, is talk to those kinds of people and let other people know what they're doing. Maybe get them enthused about contributing as well. We talked a little bit about the fact that your industry is changing, and let's talk about how people get their news. As someone who has lived in Kingston for 60 years almost, the paper doesn't seem to have the same sort of influence now that people can get their news from online streaming or whatever, or television, not so much radio anymore. Views on that, where is that going? Do you have a sense of that?
It's funny. I'm going to say it was 10 or more years ago, maybe around 10 years. I remember sitting with the editor at the time and saying, if there's anything we can do to change to reverse the course that newspapers are headed on, in my opinion, it is we have to stop publishing national news and national entertainment and national sports and international stuff and business, and remove all that stuff and put all of our focuses on what's going on in Kingston, because we just can't keep up. We're just not a place where people will go for that kind of news, and we're wasting, the paper that it's printed on, in my opinion, as our numbers were dwindling. And I mean, it was strictly an advertising problem for newspapers. Like, subscribers were great, and they were what we could use to bring advertisers aboard, and it was a very simple model for a long, long time. It was, we publish a newspaper, we have this many staff, we can produce, when I started at the Whig, I think the paper was still 60 some pages, and you could draw advertisers in and sell them ads. Well, as advertisers walked away to the internet because they went, wow, I can create my own website, and for a fraction of what I'm spending a year in advertising and newspapers and radio and TV, as they disappeared, once those big national ones started pulling out, the car dealerships, the movies, the big real estate, things like that, the paper got smaller because they had to start making cuts, and then subscribers started to dwindle, and it was just a snowball. We're seeing it now in radio, we're seeing it now in television. What we saw in newspapers were just the first one out. So I said at the time, we really should focus, and that's what I do now. Like, my focus is I'm not listening to anything going on outside of Kingston in terms of my work. So that's kind of where we are, and the Kingstonists rose up. To their credit, they saw an opportunity to come into a market where the Whig was wounded and, trying to survive downsizing. The same thing has happened with Global Kingston. They've gone through some cuts. Radios are going through the same thing, but people are getting their news, unfortunately, from some bad places now. Like, they're getting it on Reddit, where I can't give you a better example of what is wrong with the world today and how quickly things can go bad than last week, when a parent posted a photo of a gentleman he alleged had approached his child at a park, and it turned out that he only suggested that the child go to a different swing. He was just making conversation with his child. Well, the internet absolutely ran this person out of town. And I remember that morning when I saw that post, I said to myself, that is dangerous. I have a mind for journalism. I know what libel is. I know what is careless and what is, just not responsible reporting. And I can't point to a better example. By the end of the day and by the next morning, if I were that individual, I would get a good lawyer, and I would sue those parents 6 ways to Sunday, because that was so irresponsible. I know think you're protecting your child's best interests and you think you're protecting other people, but you've got to be careful. And that's what's happening to news now. It's getting out on people's Facebook pages, people's Reddits, people's Twitters, X, whatever you want to call it. Real journalism is dying. Real people who are paid and trained to do the job are disappearing because of corporations, just not being able to sustain those numbers in those markets when there's just not revenue. Yeah. It's not difficult to understand, right? It's business, but journalism is being lost in that, and it's turning over to social media reporting. Like that's a great example of, what not to do.
If it's on social media, it's got to be true. It basically is what a lot of people subscribe to. If you're looking down the road 10 years from now, is there anything that people should be doing, whether it be people in the business or people reading the material that's out there, to try and stem that tide of incorrect information that's being circulated?
I mean, I've said time and again, and I'll say it until I take my last breath, if people want the Whig to be the thing that it once was, subscribe. Yeah. That's all you have to do. Pay for it. Just pay for it. I had somebody, when I put up a post a few months ago, and we finally put up a paywall after almost 200 years, And after giving it away online for, 30, the last 30, somewhere around there, 25, I said, it's $30 a year, I think, or something like that. It's ridiculously low. Like it costs pennies a day. But if everybody in Kingston signed up for it, we would be hiring people within a week.
Yeah.
It's just how it works. I mean, I went through my finances this week to look at all the, those little ones that come out every month, the Netflix, all those little monthly subscription fees. I went through them this week, and I'm spending over $200 a month on subscriptions. And I'm sure I'm similar to a lot of people. Yeah. So if you could take $30 out of that subscription base, cancel a couple of Amazon channels or, something else and move it over to support a local newspaper, you could change the industry. As far as what I see 10 years down the road, I don't see a print edition anymore. I think that's going to be gone, unfortunately. Magazines seem to have managed to hang on and reversed their fortunes, but I don't see that happening for newspapers. I just think we have to be careful that there are fewer of those instances from last week on the social media than there are responsible things. I mean, it is great for spreading news. It is great for developing a following and for keeping track of people, but you can't have news on Facebook now in Canada, so don't trust anything you see on there, and that includes from Joe Blow.
There's a lot has been written lately about bringing issues surrounding mental health out into the mainstream to make sure people know what's going on, to talk about the kinds of things that you can do to address your particular situation if you have some issues you want to try to correct. Where does the newspaper industry or journalists like yourself come into play with respect to that?
For me, that's an important issue. When I was younger, I had a lot of struggles with panic attacks and anxiety in my 20s and 30s. And, I went and I've even written a few pieces on it over the years about how I did some neurofeedback, which is an interesting and wonderful experience, which for me changed a lot of things. I didn't want to take medication. In terms of what's happening right now in Kingston, it's the crisis we're living in right now in Kingston. It's all connected. The homelessness battle is connected to the drug battle, which is connected to the mental health battle. It's all tied together, and it's become very divisive, I find. It seems that people are on one side of the subject or the other. You either think that we should be doing everything humanly possible to help these folks and get them, back on their feet and back into society, or you think we're doing nothing for them and that we should take them out of town and get them out of the city and leave them for dead. I mean, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but that's where it feels like we are. It was kind of like with COVID. At first, everybody banded together, and then the line got drawn, and it was like you were anti-vax or you were pro-vax, and that was it. There was no more middle area, and that's what's happening with the mental health issue, because I believe it's all tied together. And for us, it's an important issue. Coming into this year, in our news meetings, we said it early on in the year, one of the biggest stories of 2024 is going to be this mental health, homeless, housing crisis that Kingston is mired in, and there's no solution in sight.
I want to change gears on you just a little bit here, and that's to talk about wrestling. I noticed that you're heavily involved with wrestling as part of a business venture. I had a conversation in one of these podcasts with Sideshow, who is the morning announcer on one of the radio stations here, and he is really big into wrestling. I don't think the same way you are. I can remember when I was younger watching, and I go back to the days of Sweet Daddy Siki and all of those folks, and that's just the name I can remember, and all the other ones I can't. But what's the attraction for you in wrestling?
Boy, as long as I can remember, I've liked pro wrestling. I don't think I can pinpoint the moment I saw it for the first time, but we used to go to my friend Rob Plumley's house in Newburgh. And Rob had one of those homes when you were a kid that everyone wanted. They had a pool in the backyard, a big satellite dish in the backyard, and his parents were so cool. So we could always gather there and watch they call them PLEs now, like Premier Live Events, but they were called pay-per-views for 30 some years. And we would just get down there and watch all these crazy characters. And I can remember sitting on those couches and wrestling with each other and wrestling at school and wrestling in my basement with my brother. And then everybody reaches that point where they either fall into it for life or they kind of fall out of it. I find I have not met a soul who's never seen wrestling in their life in my entire life. It's like, oh yeah, I used to watch it when I was a kid, or my grandmother used to watch it, or my brother watched it. There's not a soul who doesn't know what it is, and that's why it's still wildly successful today. But the switch for me was when a guy by the name of Stone Cold Steve Austin came along. I was just in that right age. I was a teenager, raging hormones. You got the world by the shoulder, and you're just ready to take on anything. And this guy bursts onto the scene, and he was fighting his boss and flipping people off and drinking beer. We'd never seen anything like it. And it just resonated with me. And then as I moved through my teenage years and into my career, when I got to college, I had this crazy dream that I was going to be a photographer for WWE. And when year 2 rolled around and they wanted internships, I applied. I sent a message to WWE, and I actually was accepted. But at the time, my parents couldn't afford, it was going to be an unpaid internship down in Stamford, Connecticut, and they just couldn't afford to send me down there for the summer, and I couldn't afford to take the time off. So I ended up in Montreal working somewhere else. But it all tied together when I came to the Wig, because it became so huge by the early 2000s. It was this global phenomenon, like the wealthiest and best era of its time to that point. And I convinced the editor, Steve Lukatz, I don't even know how, that it was big enough that it warranted a space in the Wig, like the Wig, Canada's oldest daily newspaper. Now, I didn't break any ground at the Wig. Norris MacDonald covered wrestling when it would come through Kingston for decades before I came there. Greg Berliuk had written done some interviews with like Andre the Giant and people over time. But I wrote a weekly, started it as bi-weekly and moved to weekly. It became so popular. Column for 5 years. We would give away stuff, and we would have debates on the pages as to whether it belonged in sports or entertainment. And fortunately, they had offices in Canada at that time, and I caught the eye of Carl DeMarco, who was the president of WWE Canada at the time, and some of the staff working up there. They thought, hey, we got a guy that's writing about us dedicated every week, so they would give us tickets. And eventually, I got my first interview, which was all I ever wanted, was to do interviews with these people that I admired. And that was I started that column in January of 99, and it ran until 2004, and I brought back features starting in 2006, and I've done it ever since. I've been to the key turning point for me with WWE was I got a call in 2014 from Bill Pierce, the editor of the Toronto Sun, saying, we normally have guys who go cover WrestleMania for us when WWE offers these opportunities for you to come down and for the 4 days and cover the events. Both guys just came off. It always happens around Easter. Both guys are either off or going to be off for Easter, and they don't want to spare it. They don't want to use any more time. Would you like to go? I didn't have a passport. This was a week before the event. So I had to scramble to get my passport in Ottawa and jump on a flight. And I'd never flown anywhere in my life, and I had anxiety about it. And I had to fly to California. And I did it. I don't know how I did it. And I got on that plane, and I landed in California, and I had the time of my life. And I've been to every WrestleMania since, except for the pandemic years. And I just came back from Philadelphia. Yesterday I was working with WWE all day because they're coming up for a major event in Toronto in a few weeks. And I'm going to be up there for 4 or 5 days. And yeah, so Sideshow now owns Chinlock with me. When my previous co-owner decided he wanted to get out of the game after 8.5 years. I didn't want to do it alone. It's a lot of work to put on these shows, and Ryan Sideshow had worked with us almost the whole time as an announcer and helping us with production and things like that. So I just said to him, I'm like, hey, do you want to step in and run the company with me? And he stepped up, and we've been doing it now together for about a year. And I love wrestling. I'm a proud lover of wrestling. I have interviewed everyone I ever wanted to except Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's eluded me so far. I've interviewed The Rock. I've interviewed Hulk Hogan. I've interviewed, Sergeant Slaughter and Ted DiBiase. I've traveled with these guys. I've done tours with them. I've brought them up here for people to meet. We ran a show in 2019 where we drew 3,000 people to the now Slush Puppy place, then Leon Center. And over the course of history, and this is the one thing I've always said about Chinlock, it was only ever a passion project meant to do other things for other people. And we have raised in excess of $250,000 for charity in the 10 years that we've been doing it. Never taken a nickel out of that company. It's only for charity, and that's why I'm so fiercely protective of it.
And you also have a lot of fun doing it.
Oh my God, it's the best. I've been hit with, I think my favorite story, my kids won't agree, but we did a show at Queens in 2018. We brought up some legends, and at the time I was in a feud with the CJ Felony, who helped me run the company for those 8+ years. We had a feud that went on for years and years, and people just loved it. And that feud culminated in a match at that show where I was hit by a garbage can, but my kids were in the front row and they didn't know it was going to happen, and they were just little girls. So when he clobbered me with this garbage can to the head and I fell to the ring, my kids, I could hear them screaming blue murder at the side. My then wife had to meet me backstage and be like, you need to go out and tell the girls that you're okay because they think you're gotta love wrestling. You've got to love wrestling. We've done a lot of fun things. We've, Bill Willich got in the ring for us a few times. Spenny from Kenny vs. Spenny. Tommy Dreamer's a good friend of mine, an ECW original, that comes up and helps us pull all these massive events off. So much fun. I have lived a wonderful life. I have professionally, I think there was a line, professionally my life's at a 10. That's it. It's at a 10. I love what I do.
Yeah.
And I love that I'm able to use that platform to have created this other thing that I love.
Well, listen, keep reading those stories about those people, and we'll be reading them. And I want to thank you for your time today. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, and I love it. If anyone has any stories they want me to cover, know people I don't know, reach out to me. My email is in the wig. It's online. It's not hard to find.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Our guest in this episode was Jan Murphy. If you'd like to contact him, his email is janmurphy, all one word, @postmedia.com. To those of you who have taken the time to listen, thank you, and I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the KingstonianPodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.